Bon matin, good morning, Tanashi, welcome. Dishinakashon Selena. I am Métis from the prairies and grateful to be a guest here on these lands. I also am the director of the City of Toronto's Indigenous Affairs Office. I would like to extend gratitude and an Eskimo to Grandmother Dorothy for helping us start in a good way and calling our ancestors in and their spirits to be with us today. Please welcome Mayor Tory, who will share some remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to begin by saying thank you to Selena for the introduction and for all the hard work that she does in our Indigenous Affairs Office, which is something initiated during my time here and under the leadership as well of Councillor Layton and the City Council. And I want to thank Grandmother Dorothy for your words starting off today's event in such a good way. This is a very, very important day. You know, there's lots of news that circulates every day in a big city, and there's snow reports and there's transit reports and so on, but I don't think anyone should underestimate for a moment how important this step forward is. And it's only a step forward, but it's a significant step forward. A journalist asked me the other day why I wasn't more emotional about being at the St. Patrick's Day parade and people being back out in a city that was reopening itself, and I said, well, it's not in my nature, but I'm inclined to be a bit more emotional about this because it represents so much history, and so much of that history is not something to be proud of. In fact, it's something to be ashamed of. But I think we're in a good place and going to a better place now as a result of the work that's been done that's brought us to today. And today is really just a beginning, and that's been made very clear to me by the leadership of the Indigenous communities that I've spoken with as recently as this past week. But it is nonetheless a very, very important day, and it is a pleasure to be joined not just by Brian Winters, who's the co-chair of our Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee, which is doing such wonderful work for us. All of the members of that committee are to be thanked for the efforts they're putting in to assist us, but also by Selena herself, who is the director of our Indigenous Affairs Office, by our city manager, Chris Murray, and by Councillor Mike Layton, and I'll make some remarks about all of them as we go through. I want to begin the formal part of my remarks by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm very proud, but at the same time very humbled to share with the media and with the public today the details on the City of Toronto's first Reconciliation Action Plan, which has been made public today and which goes to the Executive Committee of the City for consideration next week. This plan, as it continues to evolve over time, and it will continue to, and it must continue to evolve over time, it will guide the Toronto Public Service over the next 10 years from 2022 to 2032 to advance truth, justice, and reconciliation in the City of Toronto. And people will ask about how important that is to the City of Toronto. Well, the City of Toronto is home to the largest population of urban Indigenous people in the country. The numbers vary depending on, I guess, who's doing the counting and so forth and how you do the counting, but let's assume that it's fair to say somewhere between 70 and 100,000 residents of the City of Toronto have Indigenous roots, and that is a very large group of people, and of course it isn't just any large group of people, it's a very particular large group of people with a very particular history both in the city and outside of the city. A lot of work's been done by the federal government. Many of the conversations we see that are public conversations happen quite properly at that level given the nature of the Constitution and so on. But we are the largest municipality in Canada. We have a large and diverse Indigenous population, and so it is essential that we do our part. And I want to do more than doing our part. I want us to set an example in this country. We have a role to play, all of us do, in advancing truth and reconciliation, and no one can afford to say it's somebody else's job. I want Toronto to be in a position of leadership when it comes to reconciliation because we have a large Indigenous population, but also because, and more importantly, it is the right thing for us to do. And it is why, under my leadership, and I'm proud to say that, together with support, of course, from the entire City Council and from our City Manager and the Public Service, we created Toronto's first ever Indigenous Affairs Office, which is led so capably by Selena Young. This was an important step forward, and it was a statement, at last, in and of itself, that truth and reconciliation were going to be treated as a government-wide priority at Toronto City Hall. And while we've made significant progress over the years, we know that there is much more that we can do and that we must do. It's 2022, and this plan has been in the works for a while now, but we want to do it right, and we want to make sure that our partners are by our side as we move forward. Getting to this stage wouldn't have been possible without the advice and engagement of the Indigenous communities. But now, if the plan is to be as legitimate and effective as we need it to be in the eyes of Indigenous Torontonians and Indigenous people across this country, then we have to immediately broaden and deepen that engagement, even as we move forward on some of the plan's priorities. There's a line in the report that says, "Nothing about us without us." And I think it very well sums up an approach that is going to be different than has been taken by governments in the past, where oftentimes governments drew up reports and said, well, this is a great report because we drew it up here and we had all the experts involved, and it's going to be good for you, whoever the people were that it was meant to benefit. And Indigenous communities have often been the recipients of those reports, written up in good faith, I would say, by governments, but nonetheless not written by them about them. Nothing about us without us. The plan represents a solid and committed base, and I'll be looking for Indigenous communities, as will I'm sure my colleagues, to shape it and to evolve it so as to own it as we work together to bring about real reconciliation. We know that there's an urgent need to confront the lasting legacy of colonialism and redress the harm inflicted on generations of Indigenous people. And I think a lot of people out there, as I did at one time, want to have an example of colonialism. Well, it can be exactly what I just said. The notion that governments, yes, duly elected governments that we have as part of our democratic system here today, write up reports about our first people and say, well, we know what's best for you, and then assume that those reports are the right kinds of reports. This harm inflicted on generations of Indigenous people was made all the more clear this past year as we continued to mourn the young lives stolen by Canada's residential and day school system, and continue to experience more and more shameful revelations across the country, including some right here in Ontario. So the Reconciliation Action Plan will help to advance the city's efforts through 28 meaningful and concrete actions which flow across 5 themes: actions to restore truth, actions to right relations and share power, actions for justice, actions to make financial reparations, and actions for the Indigenous Affairs Office itself. When implemented, these 28 actions will contribute to the visibility and overall well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Toronto through placemaking and placekeeping, through supporting economic development and prosperity, through increasing civic engagement, through honoring Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and through recognizing rights to self-determination and self-governance. As a city, we will also continue to support Indigenous health, safety, and well-being, increase access to affordable housing, and support Indigenous businesses, entrepreneurs, and artists. I learn something each and every day in this job, many things each and every day. It's one of the great things about having a privilege of serving in a job like this. And one of them that you learned early on is when it comes to the problem of homelessness, for example, Indigenous communities are far overrepresented in the population of people experiencing homelessness. So it makes it, all the more we have to address the entire problem and all the people who are experiencing homelessness, but Indigenous communities in particular are especially in need of our partnership with them in forging solutions to that particular aspect of this. And affordable housing has been a major priority for Indigenous communities and will be a major driver for us going forward. And I'm proud of the fact that we're starting to forge today some true partnerships. One of the things I learned in my meetings with all of the agencies, and I've met with them one by one, is that they said to us again, as an evidence of what sometimes gets categorized under colonialism, that we would develop all kinds of housing programs but wouldn't have Indigenous communities as real partners, actual real partners in delivering those housing solutions. And now that's exactly what we're doing, is having real partnerships that involve the leadership, in fact, being taken, the initiative by Indigenous communities in that. And we made it a top priority last year, and this is the best evidence you ever have, is, you put your money where your mouth is. We allocated funding to the creation of 5,200 affordable rental homes for Indigenous, by Indigenous communities in partnership with Ms. Webick Development Corporation, who are going to be excellent partners for us in actually getting those 5,200 units built and lived in. Indigenous leaders told me directly about the need for the housing itself, yes, but they also told me of the necessity of the Indigenous communities being real partners in the development of that housing, and this is an example of our response to that. And it's part of City Council's decision that at least 20% of the $132 million made available to support the creation of affordable rental housing under the federal government's Rapid Housing Initiative has been allocated to Indigenous people by Indigenous organizations. And this is on top of the commitment made during the first phase of the Rapid Housing Initiative, which allocated 20% of then 540 units for Indigenous communities. Beyond housing, there's a lot more to cover, and we are committed to dedicating the necessary financial resources towards supporting the actions that are outlined in the plan. So I encourage people to read the plan, and it requires careful reading because there's a lot to it and a lot of areas that are covered in it, and there are many tangible actions that we are committed to taking. In 2022 alone, our immediate focus will be on establishing processes and relationships and priorities as we begin to implement the plan, because the message was conveyed loud and clear to me that this just cannot be another government report, notwithstanding the degree of engagement of the Indigenous communities in writing it, that can be implemented by us alone as government because we somehow know best. This year, I'm proud to say, we'll be implementing, for example, an Indigenous crisis response pilot, which will test a new non-police-led approach to responding to non-emergency, non-violent calls, including those involved in particular in people in crisis and people in distress, and wellness checks. And I'm very proud to say this pilot project will be Indigenous-led, and people with lived experience will respond and support the needs of Indigenous communities in our city. This will be in the downtown west. We will begin the construction of the Indian Residential School Survivors Spirit Garden at Nathan Phillips Square in partnership with Toronto Council Fire. They're in fact leading this initiative, which will be in a place of great significance at the heart of our civic democracy here in Nathan Phillips Square. This will be a permanent feature that will honor residential school survivors and all the children who were tragically lost. And construction will be at the very heart of the city and will be completed by late 2023. And I'm proud to say again that with the support of the City Council, the city is contributing $13 million towards this project, which will be a very important symbolic location in the city, but will also, I think, end up being something incredibly important from an educational perspective for people who are both residents and visitors to this city. We'll be finding this year an operator for the Indigenous Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And this will be an incredibly important and innovative place for the Indigenous communities to explore their entrepreneurial aspirations by providing space and business programming and advisory services and mentorship supports and workspace that can be shared in the cause of making sure that enterprise is something that can be pursued by these communities as much as by everybody else in a very culturally sensitive way. And this year alone, we've committed to fund $3.5 million for these projects, and we're prepared as a city to continue to invest and to do what we have to do to make sure that this plan comes to fruition. So I want to acknowledge that these actions are just the next steps we will take in 2022 alone on a long path towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I want to reiterate that the Reconciliation Action Plan is a living document that will grow, and it will evolve, and it must grow, and it must evolve as needed to ensure that it is in fact credible and effective as seen through the eyes of Indigenous communities, and is a work plan for the government that comes from our Indigenous communities, a work plan for the government, what we have to do, that comes from Indigenous partners. I plan to be very much a part of continuing to grow confidence in that evolving plan, because I know that it can't be just seen as another government plan. In fact, it shouldn't be seen as a government plan at all. It should be seen as a work plan for us from the Indigenous partners, and that we have to then get on with implementing it with them right here and right now. And we're committed to maintaining transparency and accountability as we go about this process and as these actions are implemented. They draw from dialogue with Indigenous communities across Toronto, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, including community members, organizations, elders, knowledge carriers, and youth. as well as employees and allies in the Toronto Public Service, of which there are many. But we know that there is still need for more engagement in order to make sure that this plan is seen as credible and is seen as effective. It was guided by our Statement of Commitment to Indigenous Peoples. It was guided by the calls to action set out in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. It was guided by the principles detailed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and by the calls for justice outlined by the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And I did, as I mentioned earlier, convene meetings with the agencies, dozens of them, one by one by one, that serve Indigenous communities so that I could understand what they're doing and what their challenges are. And I should tell you that we've also had the complete commitment of not only Selena in our Indigenous Affairs Office, but of our city manager at the highest level, Chris Murray. And I should tell you, a person who's been of great inspiration and encouragement, and I feel, even though he never makes me feel this way deliberately, I feel like he holds me to account, and quite properly so, and that is Councillor Mike Layton, who has put a great deal of passion and commitment into this area of making sure that we do better than we have done before. It's given me an opportunity, though, from him and from Selena and from the agencies and all the people involved to listen and to learn and to engage about the visions and expectations that the people that we're partnering with and that we serve are expecting from our city. And so it's not the end, it's the beginning. And on that note, I do want to thank everyone who's contributed to what has been a long process leading to this very important plan that is being put forward today. They've shared their experiences and their knowledge to help to inform this plan, and that includes organizations like the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council and its president, Francis Sanderson, who's been an incredibly important and wise councillor to me, including up to and as recently as this past week. And I want to thank Brian, who's here on behalf of his co-chair, Pamela Hart, for their continued leadership as co-chairs of the Aboriginal Advisory Committee, and you will hear from him shortly. I look forward to walking this path of reconciliation together and continuing our efforts to make make Toronto a city where Indigenous peoples and culture and expertise and ways of being can be properly and completely respected. And I'm confident because of what I see as the going-in approach, starting, I hope, with me and through the city manager, my colleague, in particular Mike Layton, but all the members of City Council and all the members of the public service and all the people who are going to be the leaders and the partners in this process of evolution and growth and the development of credibility and effectiveness of this plan, that we will be able to create and implement the much needed change that I think we all recognize is necessary. I would like to now ask City Manager Chris Murray to come forward and say a few words.
So first of all, I just want to thank Mayor Tory for his words. I must also tell you that I am a ninth generation settler. My Acadian ancestors arrived on the shores of Nova Scotia in 1634. I am also first generation on my father's side, his family arrived from Northern Ireland to a place called Melrose, New Brunswick, in the late 1920s. So I am more than pleased, both professionally and personally, to be here today to discuss the Reconciliation Action Plan, which I think will be critical to moving the Toronto Public Service forward on our ongoing path towards reconciliation with the Indigenous communities of Toronto. I think it's absolutely essential that reconciliation be embedded into the work of every division that makes up the Toronto Public Service. And I believe that the Reconciliation Action Plan will be the guideline of those actions that we need to take in order to address our responsibilities. This is a shared responsibility that every employee, all 37,000 of us in the Toronto Public Service, have to respect, and we all have to recognize that we have a role to play. Toronto, over many, many years, has made commitments, but those commitments will ring hollow unless we, in fact, focus on the actions in the plan and make sure that the financial commitment to make those actions happen do happen. The Reconciliation Action Plan provides an opportunity for the city to create and maintain meaningful relationships for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and to collaborate to restore truth, rights relations, and contribute to a just future for Indigenous peoples. A key priority will be addressing barriers and colonial practices embedded in our policies, our programs, and our practices, and to address them in order to better serve Indigenous residents in Toronto and to live up to the values and principles that underpin the plan. This work will be audited on a regular basis and communicated. We're also committed to ensuring that Toronto Public Service reflects the diverse residents we serve, and that includes large and diverse Indigenous population that Mayor Tory just spoke of. That is why, as part of the plan, we'll be developing Indigenous recruitment strategies and supporting Indigenous staff retention across the organization through training and mentorship responsibilities. We also recognize the importance of building Indigenous cultural awareness in the Toronto Public Service through mandatory training and ongoing education programming for all city staff. Beyond the Toronto Public Service, we are asking Council in this report to request city agencies and boards, including the Toronto Police Services Board, Toronto Library, to commit to their own reconciliation efforts, of course guided by the values and principles set out in the reconciliation plan. I want to acknowledge that the reconciliation plan was a collaborative effort, as most things that we do here at City Hall are. That, of course, they involved over the last few years engagement of community members, Indigenous community institutions, and as a result of all of that, the work that our staff has done, we are here today with a plan that is, just as I think Mayor Tory's pointed out, an important first step, a beginning. And to the point which is fundamental to community development, never about us, without us, I think is a principle that has to underpin the work that we're doing. And I too want to recognize actually two people, Francis Sanderson, who I do regularly talk to give me guidance, as well as Larry Frost, who's here today. These are two individuals from this community that are critically important, I think, not just to myself and Selena's, but will be, I think, to others in this organization as we find our path to move forward and deliver on the actions in the plan. I, of course, have to thank Selena Young and her team, some of the members are here today, for what is not easy work. In my previous role as city manager in Hamilton, I had the good fortune of working with the Haudenosaunee on a series of 8 agreements related to a road project in that community. And it's probably not just the most challenging, but easily the most rewarding work I've ever been involved in. And I know the work that Selena does. She comes to it every day with a good mind, a good heart, and a lot of effort from her staff. And so I have to sit here, or stand here, and applaud everything that she's done. We are committed to uncovering hard truths and having those difficult but absolutely necessary conversations to create the kind of change that is going to be critical in the Toronto Public Service and critical to this community. We are committed to building and repairing relationships with Indigenous peoples, with elders, knowledge carriers, and youth who can remind us of our responsibilities to the land and water. The Reconciliation Action Plan will help guide the city and Toronto Public Service in particular towards a more inclusive and representative city with and for Indigenous peoples. And so with that, I absolutely look forward to beginning this journey with this Indigenous community, doing our absolute best to make sure that the 28 actions in the plans are lived. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. And I want to introduce now, as the mayor has pointed out, a true leader on council, an individual who I think it's in his DNA to be here to support what's happening in terms of the Reconciliation Action Plan and to support the Indigenous community that we're here to serve. Thanks very much, Miigwech. Councillor Layton.
Ani Bozu. Hello, everyone. I would also like to offer my thanks to Elder Peters, to Selena Young from the Indigenous Affairs Office, to our City Manager, Chris Murray, for his commitment to seeing this project through, to our Mayor, who's always had an open mind and a strong heart to take on issues of reconciliation and engaging our Indigenous community, to Co-Chair Brian Winters, to Larry Frost, who are here as well. Brian's relatively new to the role, but but Larry's been on the committee since I have, and that's over a decade. I think he's been here since the very beginning of the formation of that committee. And I think that speaks to the importance that the community places in driving these issues forward and making and holding the City of Toronto accountable to the commitments that we made. Today is an important day in the City of Toronto. Our journey towards reconciliation and making amends with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people is taking an important step forward. As a settler ally and member of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee for over a decade, I have witnessed firsthand the progress that we've made, but also the struggles along the road. This has not been an easy journey. For this dialogue to mean something, it can't be an easy journey. As our city manager said, these are difficult truths for us to understand and for us to accept. But that speaks to the importance of us having those conversations, building that understanding, and finding a path forward together. I look out at Nathan Phillips Square, and I see it as a reflection. It's almost like a little picture, a picture of Toronto. We're there when we celebrate every year at New Year's. We're there when we celebrate the Raptors win. We're there to protest. We're there with homeless advocates. We're there with peace advocates. We're there with those that came from the same country of origin of us as we raised the flags. You know, when I started here in 2010, that's what we did. We had a sunrise ceremony once a year. That was the reflection of our commitment to Indigenous people from the City of Toronto. We raised the flag, we had some ceremony, and then we went back to our work. Over the last decades, that's changed. The flags of the Confederacy of Canada aren't the only flags that fly in the square anymore. The medicine wheel on the Toronto sign, the sign that went up as we celebrated our city in our North American, it was Pan Am, sorry, in the Pan Am Games, we added to it. We added an important symbol. And soon we're going to add the Spirit Garden, which comes to us from Council Fire, but comes also from a recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But for those symbols to mean anything, they need to be backed up inside the building by a strong commitment from City Council through resources and a continued dialogue with our Indigenous population. And we have that here in this plan. We know it's a living document. We've heard a commitment from the city manager that it will continue to evolve through dialogue and led by the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis communities of Toronto. The actions outlined in the Reconciliation Action Plan will guide us towards a future where truth is acknowledged and justice is served so reconciliation can be possible. Now, I fully support this plan, and I look forward to seeing it pass City Council so we can continue taking these steps forward together. Miigwech, thank you. I'd like to introduce co-chair of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee, Brian Winters.
Good morning. Urlakud. I apologize. This is the first time I've addressed a room without a computer screen 2 feet from my face in 24 months, so I'm a little bit rusty. I want to first thank Selena and grandmother Dorothy for the beautiful opening. I apologize that my much more eloquent co-chair, Pamela Hart, was unable to be here. You're honestly getting the B team today, but some events that are scheduled in our communities just can't be rescheduled. Atira Brianoavunga, Labrador Imiuk, Sayoyunga, Toronto Miunuvunga. So my name is Brian Winters. I'm of Inuk, Labrador Inuk, and Irish Newfoundland settler descent, and I've lived in Toronto now for 5 years. I'm the senior manager of partnerships and special projects for Small Economy Works, and I deliver instruction via Inspire Nunavut. As an Indigenous person of this country, but not a natural steward of this land, I dearly appreciate the ceremonies that Grandmother Dorothy and so many of our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat cousins use to make sure that the work that we do is grounded and is moving forward in the right way, in a good way. I'd like to first acknowledge the work done by the leaders in the Indigenous support sector community in Toronto. Larry Frost is here today, and they founded the original Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council. And then that group lobbied for the creation of the Indigenous Affairs Office. I want to also thank everyone for the collective work done over the last 4 years to get us to a place where Canada's largest city is launching a formative reconciliation action plan. I know that in order to make this plan as effective as possible, the last 4 years have been full of consultations all over the city, as well as countless rewrites and edits. However, it's important for us to remember that the Reconciliation Action Plan is exactly as its title suggests. It is a plan. Now comes the hard part. Implementing this action plan will require a very high level of buy-in from the leadership of the city, as well as every one of its departments, agencies, and corporations. Luckily, the buy-in of this concept of reconciliation comes from the top, as it should. And I know that Mayor Tory, City Manager Chris Murray, and of course Selena Young and the IAO are true allies and champions to this cause. And they are here to make sure that the city moves forward with these initiatives. As part of this implementation, we have received confirmation that the City of Toronto will regularly report back to us at the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee, at the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, and the community at large, standing accountable to which initiatives have been successfully moved forward and which need more work. This accountability measure will ensure that the reconciliation plan remains a living document adjusting to the realities of our city as is necessary. I'd like to thank Mayor Tory, City Manager Chris Murray, Francis Sanderson from Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, and Selena Young for all of your leadership on the file. It's been amazing to work with all of you and see the changes in real time as you receive feedback. We have a collective responsibility as Indigenous peoples and allies to work across organizations and jurisdictions to implement the work for the community of today and our children of tomorrow. As one of the most unique, diverse, and the largest urban Indigenous population in Canada, the community here in Toronto has a real opportunity to innovate and decolonize co-development with the city. Despite the last 4 years of work on this plan, this work is still in its infancy, and we will need to respond to TARP 2 and the Task Indigenous Prosperity Plan that are also soon to be released. It is a stark reality that although the Indigenous communities and land in Toronto and the City of Toronto occupy the same space, they do not accurately reflect one another. I hope that the Prosperity Plan and Reconciliation Action Plan can reflect and be impacted by each other as is necessary. I want to acknowledge how excited I am personally about how this collective work can actually bring about real change, how we can work together to make sure that the community voice is heard and understood with data grounded in Indigenous worldviews. We will be using the Toronto Data Equity Plan to provide an evidence-based and culturally grounded roadmap for implementing change in service provision. As long as this is a policy document that was passed by a city committee, there is going to be so much initial buy-in from our local community. It isn't our document. This is something that we have agreed upon and that we have moved together to meet in the middle upon. We are going to be working to make sure that these intentions are implemented properly, but there is a degree of separation from it being owned by the Indigenous community of Toronto. It will be up to the City of Toronto to execute this action plan, to begin to repair a relationship and a level of power dynamic that has existed since Europeans first arrived on this land. The Prosperity Plan will be the Indigenous community's reply, and my hope is that the two will reflect and be directly impacted by one another. These documents come from different worldviews, and having one for all of us just wouldn't work. It wouldn't make any sense. I want to bring up the concept of SELA, as well as all our relations, and the idea that everything needs to be in balance. And this is a move in that direction. I see Larry Frost in the audience, so I can't help but mention that in that statement of balance, we do need to operate and work in unity, as he is so well known for saying. We need to collaborate in order to move ahead. I think that the mayor, the city manager, the IAO have done an incredible job with this work, and I appreciate the amount of effort that's gone into it from everyone. Nakumishiwak, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we're going to do immediate Q&A quickly before we do the closing remarks and the prayer. So we have David Ryder first from the Toronto Star. Go ahead.
Hi, I think this is for Mayor Tory or maybe Mr. Young. That I understand from a colleague who's quickly reading the report that it says the costs of implementation for the first year included in the 2002 approved budget, and that there is essentially no kind of either annual budget or one big figure for the 10-year plan. That always raises concerns about, is this going to get eroded because of other priorities? So can you address that? Why is there no kind of final price tag for this?
I think oftentimes you're better off not to have a price tag, because if the report is as we say, which is it's a plan, but it has to be then treated as a living document, and the actual implementation of it is going to be led by Indigenous communities, and we're going to be, a plan they're going to take ownership of, which we're going to be responsive to, that the resources will follow. I can just tell you right now that for me, and I'm sure that it may be one of those occasions I can speak, I think, for Councillor Layton, and I think the majority of Council we're serious about this. This is something, and if you look, for example, at the one example I mentioned this morning, in particular, housing, that actually is a commitment that has funding that goes for a number of years to actually implement that and get those 5,200 units, affordable units, put into place. And so I think sometimes we look at a particular budget number that's in for a particular year and fail to take account of the fact that a number of the initiatives already underway, certainly initiatives that are a priority in this plan, are things that have funding sources that are already in place because we're determined to proceed with them and do them in partnership with Indigenous communities. So I think this is something that, we as a city government, from the elected representatives through the public service, take very seriously. The resources will be allocated. Throughout my time here, we've had, I think, quite a bit of success in having plans that have annual work plans that are developed with resource requirements that go with that, and that by producing the annual work plan, you also produce a budgetary number that gets included in the budget because it's part of the work plan. And so I'm confident that the resources will be there, and that, again, what you don't want to do in the context of trying to get ahead of yourself, and in particular get ahead of the people who we want to take more ownership of this, as Brian mentioned, is to specify every dollar and every allocation of dollars in advance of the present year, because we're going to work together to produce those numbers and to make sure those resources are there.
Thank you. My follow-up is maybe for Selina or anybody else who wants to answer, is that Selina, a predecessor of yours, left and essentially made a complaint, as I understand it, saying that the city wasn't supporting her efforts, and there was talk about smudge ceremonies not being allowed. Has that changed? How do you feel, from your perspective and from your office's perspective and your community's perspective, is the city now serious about this?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you for the question. So it's unfortunate that we have to learn from our mistakes, but we do. And it's important that we do, and I think that's an instance where almost 4 years ago, when I started at the city, and I learned about practices before I started, we were able to work together to make those changes. So for cultural protocol reasons, it was not live streamed or on camera, but we started today with a really important ceremony. That's really, we have to ground ourselves in doing this work. So having Grandmother Dorothy with us is a perfect example of how things have changed. We also, now at City Hall, this was in the before times, before the pandemic, established a Indigenous staff space on the 3rd floor here at City Hall. So all Indigenous staff at the city, if they need space, they need access to medicines, smudging, they can go there. It's also a great space to sit and talk with community members. There's offering of medicines happened in where we are now at the Members Lounge, as well as council chambers, various boardrooms across City Hall. So thankfully, we are learning and changing.
Thank you. And next up, oh,
Sorry if I could,
go ahead.
Lavin. I think we've learned the lessons in other ways too, and I mentioned 2 examples this morning. I think these are very important as just examples of how we're going to try to be consistent in our approach. I talked about housing, and in fact, in the past, we would have been more likely to develop a plan to have housing units, affordable housing units for members of Indigenous communities, but that we would have been more likely to, in some way or other, develop those plans and implement those plans ourselves. But now, and it was input I got directly from these agencies when I met with them, they said, no, we want to be, we need to be, we must be real partners in developing and delivering that housing, and they are now. And the same is true of the crisis response pilot for Indigenous communities. And that is going to be led by and delivered by Indigenous organizations, as opposed to in the past we might have been more inclined, because sometimes it's just easier, easier in the context of, less trouble, as it were, to sort of, do it yourself and think you know how to do it. And if it's going to be done in a culturally sensitive way, and if it's going to be done in a way that addresses some of those mistakes that were made in the past, then it's going to be done with the leadership of and at the initiative of Indigenous organizations. And I think some of those proof points beyond some of the processes Selena talked about are hopefully very solid indications of our intention to do things differently and to have the organizations that are our partners take ownership of the practical delivery of these services and supports as part of this reconciliation process.
Thank you. And last question is going to be from Adrian from CBC Radio Canada.
Hi, my first question is about hiring more Indigenous people to work in the public service and at a municipal level of the government. Do you have a specific deadline, just like metrics about how many people you'd like to hire, when, at all levels of municipal government? Can you give me more information about that? Someone, whoever is best.
The Reconciliation Action Plan has one of the 28 actions is Indigenous recruitment and retention. So we can bring all the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis we want into the city, but if there isn't the culture to support us, we won't stay, right? So it's really important to think about both recruitment and retention. And there are particular recruitment targets in the action plan. And then we're looking at working, constant engagement with community is really important, and we're really blessed in the City of Toronto to have Misway Beak, Aboriginal Training and Employment Centre, that's been around for a very long time. They're a key partner in helping provide support and different access to programs, so we can learn from them and be able to bring in Indigenous talent. We know there's talented Indigenous folks. Some of them work in the city already, but there's lots more out there. And so, yeah, that's a really important piece of the action plan, to support staff that are here, to bring more Indigenous recruits in. And we also acknowledge that the City of Toronto is a huge employer. You heard Chris mention 37,000 staff, right? So we have a role to play as a public service in reflecting the community we serve. So the targets in the action plan are related to that. We want to reflect the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community in Toronto through our staffing complement.
My follow-up question is about housing, affordable housing. You, Mayor Tory, talked about 5,200 units that will be built. I'm not sure I understood everything. Is it 5,200 units for Indigenous people, and when will they be built, and what's specific about those units that will better meet Indigenous people's needs?
Well, it's very interesting that you ask me that question about what's specific about these units that's going to be better for Indigenous residents. And in fact, that question will be answered by our partner, the Misway organization, because they will determine, as well they should, as people who are from and by and very much a part of Indigenous communities in Toronto, how those units will be different in a culturally and practically sensitive way to serve the particular needs of Indigenous Torontonians. But the answer to your question is yes, those 5,200 units are all to be, affordable units are all to be for the benefit of and for the residents of Indigenous Torontonians. And it is part of the overall housing action plan that stretches over a period of years. But some of them, the first phase, I think I mentioned 540, I think was the number, are being delivered now, and they're going to be delivered in time as housing developments are. But the key part of it is the partnership, and that the determination of the answer to your question is what's going to be different about them, besides them being affordable housing units, is going to be determined by our Indigenous partners in making that happen. And I think that's a departure for us, but a very positive departure in terms of how we will go forward as well in partnership, real partnership.
Okay, that's it for the questions. We'll now do closing remarks from Selena.
Marcy, thank you for all your questions and for attending today's event. As both a city employee and a Métis woman, I'm so glad to see the city's first Reconciliation Action Plan moving forward and continuing our journey towards truth, justice, and reconciliation. That closes the official photographed portion of this event. I'd really like to welcome Grandmother Dorothy back up to help us close in a good way.